By the second night, when the snow was still coming down outside the window and the fire had burned low enough to need attention, and she said those words across the small kitchen table like she had been carrying them since the afternoon before, Owen Calloway understood that the storm had done something that 3 years of working in the same building had not been able to do, which was make pretending feel like more work than the truth. Owen was 41 years old, a project coordinator for a mid-sized timber construction company out of Bozeman, Montana, the kind of work that involved spreadsheets and site schedules and long drives on roads that the state repaved every other year if the budget allowed. He had been divorced for 3 years from a woman named Judith who had left not because of anything dramatic, but because they had become two people sharing a calendar and not much else, and they had both had the grace to admit it before it became something uglier. He lived alone in a rental house with a wood stove and a dog named Kelso and a bookshelf he had built himself that leaned 4 degrees off vertical and that he had decided to keep because fixing it would have required removing every book, and he did not have a weekend he was willing to spend that way. He had known Nora Shields for 3 years. She was the company's resource analyst, 37, the person who looked at a project schedule and found the 4 things everyone else had missed. She wore reading glasses she was always taking on and off, had dark red hair she pulled back in a knot that never quite held, and had a way of being right about things without making you feel wrong, which is considerably rarer than it sounds. She had been engaged once, to a man named Phil, who had turned out to be someone she had been managing rather than loving, and she had ended it 18 months ago with what she described once, briefly, as the calmest difficult thing she had ever done. They got along well. That was the agreed-upon version. They worked closely on project timelines, reviewed each other's forecasts, shared a standing Wednesday lunch order from the Thai place 2 blocks from the office. They were comfortable with each other in the specific way that implies some suppression is involved. The company retreat to the Clearwater cabin had been planned since September. 12 people, a long weekend of strategy sessions and team-building exercises, someone had found in a management book, a van from the office, a cabin with 6 rooms and a main kitchen and a porch that looked out over the valley. It had been planned that way. What actually happened was that the van left on Friday morning with 12 people and returned Sunday afternoon with 10 because the storm that the Weather Service had called a 70% chance had shown up and established itself with the seriousness of something that intended to stay. The road out of the Clearwater Valley was closed by Saturday evening. Owen and Nora were the 2 who had stayed behind to do a final walkthrough of the cabin while the van made its first run, and by the time the van was supposed to circle back, the road was 2 feet under, and the county was asking everyone to shelter. The team manager called from the warmth of his Bozeman living room and said they were sure Owen and Nora could manage, and that he was very sorry, and that the company would obviously cover any additional expenses. Owen and Nora stood in the cabin kitchen with the wind pressing against the glass and looked at each other in the way 2 people look at each other when a situation has become undeniable. Nora said, "There's enough food for 4 days." Owen said, "Firewood?" She said, "I counted. We're fine." She pushed her glasses up with one finger. "There are 2 separate bedrooms," he said. "I was not about to say anything about that." She said, "I know. I was saying it for myself." The first night was easy, in the way that any situation is easy when everyone is still performing for a hypothetical audience. They made pasta from what was in the pantry, argued without heat about the best way to salt the water, discovered they had the same opinion about one specific kind of project manager that neither of them had ever said out loud at the office, and laughed more than the combined total of the previous 3 years of Wednesday lunches had produced. The wind was heavy against the windows. The fire held. They went to their separate rooms at 10:30. Owen lay in the dark and listened to the snow against the roof and thought about the way she had laughed during dinner, a real one, not the office version, and told himself it was simply the novelty of the situation, and that by the time the road cleared, everything would be calibrated back to normal. Saturday arrived white and still deepening. The roads were still closed. They built the fire up in the morning and sat at the table with coffee and the company laptops, attempting to treat the day as a remote work day, which worked for approximately 90 minutes before the Wi-Fi became too unreliable to maintain the pretense. What followed was a Saturday that Owen would think about for a long time afterward, not because anything happened that could be described as an event, but because of what a day without performance turned out to look like. They read. She had a novel she had been carrying since October. He found a history of the Montana copper mines in the cabin's small bookshelf and read it with the genuine attention it deserved. They made lunch together from the cabin pantry, a soup that took longer than it needed to because neither of them was in a hurry. She told him about her father, who had been a lineman for the power company and who had died 6 years ago, and whom she missed in the specific way you miss someone whose absence changes the shape of ordinary days. He told her about the bookshelf that leaned 4 degrees and why he had decided to keep it. She said that was either very lazy or very wise, and she had not decided which. He said it was probably both. In the afternoon, the snow slowed. They put on coats and walked out onto the porch and looked at the valley below, which was white and perfectly quiet in the way that only happens when the world is insulated from itself. The cold was the deep, dry kind, the kind that smells like pine and altitude. She stood beside him at the railing with her coat collar up and her coffee mug in both hands and said nothing for a long time, and the silence was not awkward, which told him something he filed away without examining. She said, "I've been trying to figure out what I actually want, not what makes sense, what I want." He said, "And?" She said, "I think I've been deciding it's the same thing." He did not ask what that meant. He had learned somewhere that some statements need the space of not being immediately questioned. They stood there until the cold won and went back inside. Saturday dinner was quieter than Friday's, not uncomfortable, but more careful, as though both of them were aware that the easy performance of the previous evening was no longer available, and what remained was something more honest and therefore more exposed. He grilled the last of the chicken on the cabin stovetop. She made a salad from what she could find. They ate with the fire going and the lamp on the table between them, casting the kind of warm, amber light that makes any face look like it belongs in a painting. She was the one who finally said it. She had been holding her wine glass with both hands, looking at the fire, and she turned and looked at him directly and said, "I stopped pretending yesterday." He said, "Pretending what?" She said, "That this is just comfortable." She did not look away. "That Wednesday lunches are just lunches, and working late is just working late, and that I'm not aware of exactly where you are in a room." She set her glass down. "I'm tired of performing that particular version of things." He was quiet. The fire moved. The pine wood he had put on 20 minutes ago had started to catch, and the smell of it was clean and warm in the cold air of the cabin. He said, "How long?" She said, "Longer than I'm comfortable saying." He said, "I would probably not find the number surprising." She said, "That's also something I stopped pretending yesterday." He said her name the way he had never said it in 3 years of project rooms and Wednesday lunches, with the full weight of what he actually meant by it, rather than the professional wrapper that had always surrounded it before. She did not flinch from it. She sat with it the way she sat with data she already understood, with patience and without surprise. He said, "I don't want to misread this." She said, "You're not misreading it." He said, "Nora." She said, "Owen, I drove 4 hours to get to this cabin, and I have been sitting across from you for 2 days in a snowstorm, and I am telling you precisely what I mean. You are not misreading anything." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his. The fire was the only sound in the room for a while, the occasional small collapse of burning wood and the hiss of pine sap and the low wind outside the cabin windows. He said, "I should have said something. Months ago." She said, "So should I." She squeezed his hand briefly. "We're saying it now." He said, "That's fair." She smiled, and it was the smile he had been cataloging for 3 years in the incorrect file. The one he had been telling himself was collegial warmth when it was never that particular thing and had not been for a long time. They talked until past midnight, not about work, about the things that work had provided a convenient excuse not to discuss. Her sister, who lived in Vancouver, the book he was always meaning to read and never did. What she wanted the next 10 years to look like if she was building them honestly, rather than carefully. What he missed about having a life that was shared with someone who actually noticed the small things. The fire burned down, and he built it up again, and she sat on the hearthrug with her back against the stone and her wine glass on the floor beside her and talked to him the way people talk when they have stopped managing themselves for an audience. The road opened Sunday at noon. The company van came back up for them at 2. They rode down the valley with their bags in the back and the snow-covered trees moving past the windows and her shoulder touching his in the back seat, not pointedly, just there, the way things are when they have been decided. Doug from accounting was driving. He looked in the rearview mirror at some point and looked back at the road and said nothing, which Owen privately appreciated. Back in Bozeman, the ordinary life reasserted itself, the office building and the schedules and the Wednesday lunch order from the Thai place. But the ordinary life was configured differently now. The way a room is different after furniture has been moved, even if everything that mattered is still there. He brought her coffee on Tuesday mornings, real coffee from the place on Mendenhall, not the office machine. She reviewed his project timelines with the same precision as always, but left small pencil notes in the margins that had nothing to do with load-bearing schedules. In March, she came to his house for dinner and saw the bookshelf and stood in front of it for a long time and then said, 4 degrees, maybe 5. He said he was aware. She said, I like it. He said, good, it's staying. She said, I know, that's why I like it. A year and a half later, on a Saturday in October, when the cottonwoods along the creek had gone yellow and the first frost was still 2 weeks away, Owen built a fire on the back patio of a house that was now both of theirs, and Nora sat in the chair beside him with her reading glasses on top of her head and a book in her lap, and Kelso asleep against her foot. He thought about the cabin, about the snow, about the two people who had stood on a porch in the cold pretending they were just comfortable with each other and not something more specific and more permanent. He thought she had been right about the timing. They had needed the storm to do what 3 years of Wednesday lunches had not been able to do, which was remove the performance from the equation and leave only the actual thing. He was glad the weather service had been right for once. He was glad the van had gone ahead. He was glad she had been brave enough to say it out loud across a kitchen table with a fire going and a bottle of wine between them, because he was not entirely certain he would have gotten there first. Sometimes careful is just fear with better manners. He had thought about that a lot since the cabin. He had stopped complimenting himself on the restraint. What would you have done if a snowstorm stranded you alone with the one person at your job you had been pretending not to notice for longer than was honest? Would you have said something or waited for the road to clear? And have you ever been in a situation where the thing you most needed was for your usual excuses to simply become unavailable? Leave your story in the comments below. If this one stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and Owen will see you in the next one.